yesterday. I'm Adam Fennick at the University of Prince Edward Island. It's my honor today to introduce the keynote address, but before I do that, I probably have a few housekeeping things. For those of us joining the trip out to Greenwich tomorrow, which proves to be a wonderful, wonderful trip. The bus will be leaving up front here at 9 o'clock, and the forecast right now calls for rain, so make sure that you have a rain jacket. It'll be a bit warmer, so it's not going to be that cold. If you don't have a rain jacket, speak to me. I have a few extras I can hopefully pull out of the basement that we can help you along with if you haven't brought one from your distant country. The other is this evening. This evening we have a public symposium, which is down at Holland College, in which we'll be working with the public in reviewing some of the conference statement, the symposium statement that we're also going to work on here this afternoon. So those are our two announcements. I have the great honor of introducing the Honorable David MacDonald. I first met David, he probably doesn't remember, back in 1989 or so, where he was chairing the first ever Canadian Parliamentary Committee on the Environment. And they were holding hearings on this new issue that had just come up out of the 1988 Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere. Something called climate change. Actually, it wasn't called climate change, it was called global warming at that time. But this parliamentary committee set aside its partisan differences and was probably a world leader in bringing together the experts to talk about climate change, science, impacts, and ways of responding or what needed to be done. And I remember those hearings quite clearly in my own mind. It produced a report, which probably still has some great relevance to today. The second time I ran into David was down in Rio de Janeiro during the Earth Summit, the World Summit on Environment and Development, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. And David led the Canadian delegation down to Rio. He's had a distinguished career in politics as both a government minister as well as a Canadian ambassador. And most recently, I met David again after I'd come here to the University of Prince Edward Island. The president of the university had asked me to meet with this gentleman who wanted to talk about concerns with the marine environment and climate change, and thought that I would be a person to speak with him. Now, given that MacDonald is quite a common name on Prince Edward Island, I didn't realize who it was until we met up for breakfast. And since then, I've enjoyed lively conversations around our global concerns with issues such as climate change and the marine environment. And that's exactly what David's going to talk to us today. So I'll invite him up to the podium. That's your good part.
Thank you, Evan, very much, and welcome everybody. I do want to say at the outset that I feel it's a privilege to be here on the land of the Mi'kmaq people in Apikwait. I'm going to say a bit about that in a moment or two. And I was particularly pleased with the opening drum song from Eliza Knockwood for many reasons. I've gotten to know Eliza over the last few years, but in particular, her mother was a very close friend of my family's and a very close friend of my mother's over many years going back over the last half century. So it was a real family reunion for me personally, but also it reminded me of how much we have traveled already in terms of repairing the rupture in relations between Indigenous people and the rest of us, and how much work we still have to do, as we heard particularly from Charlie Sark late yesterday afternoon. So that was very important. Now I realize time is of the essence, and you're taking an incredible risk here this morning because of two reasons. The first reason is, have you ever been to a meeting where either the local clergyman or the local politician was asked to speak? You got your pillow out and wondered how long it would last. So that's one reason. And the second reason is you couldn't have located this meeting in a place that has more meaning for me personally than here at the Charlottetown Hotel. I was telling Adam yesterday when we were up on the terrace on the top of the roof of this building, but the last time I was up on the roof of this building, I was about 6 years old. You might say, what was I doing up on the roof of this building when I was 6? Well, my mother was a spotter. And she was in a gondola with a pair of binoculars. And then you'd say, well, what would she be doing in a gondola on the roof of the Charlottetown Hotel? Well, it was during the Second World War. And she was looking for enemy aircraft to be flying over Charlottetown. Just think of that for a moment. I'm not sure where these enemy aircraft were going to come from, but coming across the ocean was likely not the option. And then fast forward many decades later, when I came across from the local radio station, which was next door, who did I run into on a bus parked in front of the Charlottetown Hotel but Louis Armstrong? Pretty special thing. And then the last time I think I was in this room is only several years ago when we had hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These were the commissioners who traveled the country for the last half dozen years to unpack the tragic, tragic story of Indian residential schools. How it happened, why it happened, who it happened to, and what we do about it. And we are now at the beginning of that second part. What do we do about it? I've not been asked to speak about it this morning, so that's for another time. But this hotel is filled with such incredible memories for me personally, and I guess one could say even for most people in Charlottetown and across PEI, because it's been here for, over 85 years, and so it has a lot of history. And it's history that I want to start with this morning because we've got a bit of history of the island going right back over the last 11,000, 12,000 years from the archaeologist. And the title I've sent is actually, you saw the title in the book, well, I've taken liberties, I've changed the title. But the title I almost decided on was the one that's not up here. And it would be something like this: Glooskap's Pillow, Ablewit, Cradled on the Waves. Because the legend of Mi'kmaq people is that the creator, Glooskap, decided when he had finished creating all this part of the world, he took his paintbrush and painted these beautiful colors, which became Prince Edward Island, as the Mi'kmaq word has it, cradled on the waves, Abikwit. And it became Glooskap's Pillow in this legendary time, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And it's those thousands and thousands of years that are in my head this morning because I think we are faced with an incredible challenge that maybe we haven't really quite taken on board. I could have opened the speech this morning by saying, welcome to the Anthropocene. How many would know what I was talking about if I said Anthropocene? Good. Good. I see a few hands going up. If you were as old as I am, and you would ask geologists back in the early stages of my life, my mother when she was up on the roof, what geological age we were in, we would have said we're in the Holocene. The Holocene is this period of 12,000 years from sort of the last ice age when things kind of settled down and human communities and human activity could begin to take on some kind of an organized social and community approach. Basically, our ancestors for thousands of years have lived through that until our generation. Now, it's still not formally a new geological period. In fact, you'll notice that recently there was a meeting in London of geologists who were trying to figure out, are we actually in this new age? And if we are, how do we describe it? The simplest way to describe it is that most of the things that happened on this planet over not just thousands, but millions and billions of years happened because of unforeseen events or things over which no one had any control or initiative. But not our generation. Not us. We are children of the Anthropocene, which means that we are responsible in a way never imagined before for what's happening to the very fabric of life on planet Earth. What do I mean by that? Well, I used to say rather flippantly, years ago when we were doing the climate change stuff that I haven't talked about, that up until quite recently, the last 30 or 40 years, everybody talked about the weather, but of course nobody could do anything about it. But not us. We've been doing lots about the weather. It depends on where you want to draw the line. But we know certainly from the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the last 200 years, as we have used more and more of this stored up energy in the Earth's crust, which we call, actually, quite conveniently, fossil fuels. That has, as we have burned that, we have put it off into the atmosphere, and we now can measure in very exact terms, as we have for the last half century, how that is gradually changing the very weather of the planet itself. That's what we studied back in the late 80s, early 90s. It was pretty surprising stuff, but the point was made by one scientist after the other as we listened to them. The thing is this, no matter how long you live, you're not going to notice that it really got that much hotter on a slowly even take. That will happen. Well, actually, you know what? They were wrong about that because when you look at the last 10, 20 years, we've had the hottest years on record, including this past July. But he said the real thing that's going to stand out for you is the weather extremes. It's the flooding. It's the cyclones, the hurricanes, the droughts, and all the things that happen as a result of these massive and sudden weather dislocations. That's what happened to the people in New Jersey, or in Louisiana and New Orleans and elsewhere around the planet, all in our lifetime. So we are in this kind of scary situation of saying, how have we found ourselves in this situation? Now, if you think I'm going to, in a few minutes, relieve you of the fears and frustrations about climate change, you're wrong. I'm actually going to add to them a bit. Because I want to talk about what is the sleeping giant that we are facing today. Maybe not sleeping isn't even the word anymore. It's what's happening to the oceans of the planet, or more accurately, the ocean of the planet. We do have this sort of Cartesian way of saying, we're dividing up the world, and we're naming something this, and we're naming something that. And so when we look at these large bodies of water, these large seas, we'll call them the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, Antarctica, and that'll really help to know where places are and what's going on. But it's all fraud, because it's just one huge ocean. One of the surprising things when those first astronauts got far enough away from this planet to look back was that it wasn't green. It was blue. Blue! Who would have thought it was blue? How many maps have you seen where the whole planet is described in blue? And the other thing, if you're looking at a map of, just like, a flat map of the Earth, is that you get no idea of how big the oceans are, because almost every map maker wants to make where people are living, which is on dry land, much more interesting than all this. There's enormous bodies of water. And they are enormous. 2/3 of the surface of the Earth is ocean. The ocean. And I don't know, maybe it's just because I grew up in media and I'm mostly in Charlottetown, a lot of the time in Stanhope, I kept looking out where I couldn't see beyond the shoreline of the sea and wondering, what does all this mean? What is its impact on me as one single individual? On November the 1st, 1967, at the United Nations, a young ambassador who virtually nobody knew because he'd only been ambassador for a couple of years, and he was ambassador for a country that he barely knew, which is kind of interesting, got up and said, I want to make a speech. I want to make a speech about the future of the oceans. His speech took 2 days. Sort of like Fidel Castro in his old days, or a few other people you think of. And he was there to make really one point. We need to create an orderly, responsible regime to live with the oceans of the Earth, which we call sort of law of the sea. And he said in particular we have to think about the deep ocean, the far ocean, beyond the borders of countries, which is totally beyond the reach or capacity of any single nation or body or corporation. And he said, we need to think about this in a new way. And he recalled back to Grotius, I think his name was, in Holland too, in the 16th century, decided that he would describe what he called the freedom of the seas. That was S-E-A-S, okay, freedom of the seas. And that became an operating principle for about 3 centuries and a half. But this man, this ambassador, interestingly enough, from Malta, named Arvid Pardy, said we need to think about the common heritage of mankind. Common heritage of mankind? What was he talking about? He was talking about a large part of our global reality which no one could own or hold sway over, and which all of us would sort of hold in trust, hopefully for 2 reasons. To maintain peace and civility among the nations of the planet, and to, in some way, from whatever resources would be there in the deep seabed, become a kind of leveling resource between the very rich countries and the many very poor countries. That was his dream. And he was supported by a remarkable woman, Elizabeth Borghese, who was originally, I think, Italian, then became an American, and eventually taught at Dalhousie, who became sort of obsessed with what was happening to the oceans. Those 2 people, Arvid Pardy and Elizabeth Borghese, were the impetus for the Law of the Sea conferences, which started in the 70s in Geneva, chaired, interestingly enough, by a Canadian, Alan Beasley, from the Department of External Affairs, and created the first real large regime, the Law of the Sea, which was agreed to in 82 and ratified in 1994. And we signed on a few years later, around the turn of the century. So, this is new stuff. Now, we did not embed in that, in any detailed way, notions of the common heritage of mankind, but we did try and point to it as a necessary approach in terms of our long-term inhabiting of this planet. I would like to stand here today in 2016 and report that we've made enormous progress, that everything is now sort of sorted out. But in fact, there's just been major meetings at the United Nations among countries to talk about what do we do about the area beyond national jurisdiction, beyond these 200-mile economic zones that exist around each and every coastal country. Because the fact of the matter is that 60% of the oceans are still out in that freedom of the high seas area, and that they represent 40% of the planet. So, now you might say, well, that's all fine and good, and that sort of academic, but what's the difference? The difference is this. In my lifetime, in fact, even in the last several decades, what has happened to our marine environment, it has in some ways been pushed to the edge of collapse. The most dramatic experience I had with that was actually Rio, which I referred to. We were in the middle of Rio and all these negotiations around Agenda 21 and treaties and biodiversity and climate change, and trying to get an Earth Charter. And in the middle of it, John Crosby, you know John Crosby, Newfoundland, you know, the fisheries guy. John phoned me up and said, David, we've got a problem. I have to have a press conference and you have to chair it. I said, well, what's it going to be about, John? He said, well, we're going to close the cod fishery. I said, are you out of your cotton picking mind? You're going to close the cod fishery in Newfoundland? If there's anything that goes to the heart of every Newfoundlander, it's that the cod fishery is the way in which people have made their living for centuries. Got it diet. And so we had this extraordinary press conference in the middle of Rio when the Minister of Fisheries of Canada closed the cod fishery because there were no more cod. And you could just add to that list all the other endangered species, especially the large fish, which are now down to, in many cases, 10% or less of their basic number. But that, in a way, is only at the surface. What goes to the heart of oceans today is what's been happening to the chemical concentration. You may or may not know that when we held those hearings in late 80s, early 90s, we talked a little bit about the oceans. And we have climate scientists come to us and say, well, you know what? We're trying to absorb as much as possible of the CO2 into the atmosphere, but actually the good news story is we're getting a lot of it going into the oceans, and that's no problem. Well, a friend of mine named Alana Mitchell published a book a few years ago called Seasick, in which she documents just how big a problem this is in terms of the death of 50% of the coral, which are sort of one of the basic building blocks of life in the marine environment, and the way in which the water is warming, becoming more acid by 30%. And we have a world-class problem on our hands. It is quite possible that the crises that we thought we were dealing with over the last 10 or 20 years in climate change will be nothing in comparison to the ocean, which are the lungs of the planet. Every second breath we breathe is coming not from trees and vegetation, but coming from the ability of the oceans to generate through plankton oxygen, which is the very breath of life. And then we add to that the acidification and the warming and the swelling and the melting of the polar ice caps, and you see the kind of world-class crisis we have on our hands. But I guess the question I have to ask myself at this stage, is this all just doom and gloom? In 2008, when President Obama took office, he did something that perhaps not a lot of people noticed. He said, I want to create, in my office at the White House, a special executive office on the oceans. I think people thought this was kind of an eccentric thing to do. Why would the President of the United States, just taking office, decide that he needed to have a whole oceans retinue at the White House? Last week, when he was speaking at an oceans conference in Washington, he reaffirmed how important it had been for him as president these past 8 years to try for the first time to pull together some kind of clear, coherent vision of how the United States was going to live the changes in the oceans and the threats to the oceans. Now, I don't have time this morning to say why, after the leadership that Canada provided in the 70s and 80s on getting along the Sea Treaty and in other ways related to the marine environment, we seem to just walk away when the real big work and heavy lifting had to be done. But that's where we kind of find ourselves today. Now, it's an interesting time to be speaking about this because just the other day, there was a huge announcement about funding for new ocean research centered at Dalhousie, but involving both Memorial University and St. John's, as well as the University of Prince Edward Island here in PEI. And you're going to hear more about that later. But simply to say, there is in some ways an attempt, while it may not be coordinated with the things that I've been talking about here this morning, the opportunity for us to begin in a much bigger way about our marine responsibilities. Now, some people might say, well, why are you talking about this in a place like PEI? Well, PEI in many ways is a massive contradictions. We just celebrated a couple of years ago the fact that 150 years ago, the fathers of the Confederation came here and talked about creating some new country they might call Canada. Now, even when it happened in 1867, we waited another half dozen years before we did anything about it. And then when the railroad bankrupted the government of PEI, we decided maybe we should join up after all. But there was a kind of visionary thing that was operating in that brief period in the 1850s, 1860s, larger than just Prince Edward Island by itself. So what I would like to do is offer a kind of challenge to us here at this conference, that when we think about threats to us in terms of our coastal areas, through storm surges, through rising tides, through warming waters, that we don't just stop at the point of where, okay, we got to live with this. How do we keep the waters from rolling in, sort of like living in Holland many years ago when the dikes had to be put up? There's a second option, which I think is equally and maybe ultimately more important, and the Premier himself referred to this yesterday. It's not just a matter of learning to live with this kind of challenge or even misery. It's saying, do we have to allow ourselves to become total victims? If this really is the Anthropocene, and we have, maybe unwittingly, taken on responsibilities that we never imagined will be part of our lives, then, as President Obama said the other day, can't we just turn our backs and walk away? I don't think so. And I've got to throw out a challenge here. I think that we have two challenges that seem to be at opposite ends of the poles. One challenge is to say we need to think more creatively about how Arvid Pardo's dream of peace in the oceans, the common heritage of humanity exists, and deal with the real threats that exist now to our oceans. That is going to raise a series of difficult, tough questions, but can we really avoid them? Right at the start this morning, I referred to the fact that my mother was a spotter on the roof of enemy aircraft. Why was she doing that? Because during the Second World War, the whole country, including little PEI, mobilized to deal with it. This is a sort of a test of age here. How many people remember ration books and ration coupons during the Second World War? Only me, I guess. You've got to be 80 years old to remember that stuff. Because I remember going from the corner of Fitzroy and Connell up to Tweel's grocery store for my mother with a little ration booklet that allowed us to buy so much sugar, so much butter, so many of the staples that we would need. We never questioned the fact that we needed to do that because we knew we were in an all-out battle to save our society, our country, and maybe even the planet from the kind of dictatorships that were reflected in some parts of Europe and the Orient. as Pogo once said very eloquently, the enemy is us. And what do we do about us? How do we live our lives in a way that says we are not going to be victims, helpless victims. We are going to take the actions necessary to live in a different kind of world. That would mean some kind of a different economic model. That would mean some kind of a different relationship with nature itself. And that quite obviously means that when it comes to the original people of this land, the indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, in their great diversity, from coast to coast to coast, that we live with them and work with them in a way of mutual respect and recognition that says we need to understand how we can live here together. That's the challenge, and I would hope that we can, in practical, specific ways, in the communities we live in. I was asked the other day, how many coastal communities are there at PEI? I said, I have no idea, but I can think of only two that aren't, and that's O'Leary and Kensington. Virtually every other community on PEI is a coastal community, so every morning people get up, they're going to look out and say, hey, we've got work to do. And if you think our coastline isn't very big, it's at least the distance from here, driving distance from here to Montreal, about 1,100 kilometers. We've all got lots of opportunities to work together to make a difference so that our Pardo's dream of a common heritage for humanity is really a possibility. Thank you very much.
Thought-provoking early morning talk. Any questions for David? I won't throw this at you. Just cuddle it.
David, you attended our Island Studies Conference in 1992, our first major International Island Studies Conference. So you didn't mention islands in your talk apart from Prince Edward Island. So what about islands? What do you think islands can do, or what do you think this island can do, or going forward, or UPEI? What do you think the challenge? What do you think the opportunity might be for us?
Well, Harry, I think we've already initiated over the last quarter century one very interesting idea, and that is the ability to transfer from the incredible energy dependency we had to the utilization of wind energy. I mean, I don't know all the details about it, but I know that it grew out of some of the original initiatives around land and resources, which in itself is an interesting part of our latter history. I think that in some ways, maybe I'm so, what's the word? A part of this place. I don't think of it in a way that separates me from everything else that's happening. You know, people would say, well, oceans are ways of separating people from one another, but in fact, they are what also bring us together to, you know, in a very meaningful way with the rest of the planet. If you live somewhere in the interior, you might not feel that what's happening on the high seas or low seas is very important. If you live in this province, anywhere you live, it doesn't matter whether you live in O'Leary and Kensington, let alone any of the coastal communities, you're going to say, how healthy is that relationship? And what the two questions will be in my mind, what can I do about it as an individual in terms of lifestyle? And the other, perhaps, more encouraging thing is, what can we do together? My sense of people on the island, when they feel they've got something to do, they're pretty good at getting together and problem solving. Now, one of the unfortunate things is, and I say this from the years that I spent doing some teaching in Montreal, a lot of the early experience of working with other people came through organizations and institutions that are now pretty marginal. Best example, the churches. When I was growing up, what was happening around churches and church life and camps and conferences and all that kind of stuff was important in terms of young people getting a sense of how we work together. That's gone, that's important. The only person who may be pushing in the opposite direction right now, very dramatically, is Pope Francis I. His recent document on climate change last June and the follow-up from people, especially in the United States, with their climate covenant work is truly amazing. So who knows what kind of new formations? They may not be around systems of belief, but it is important for us to identify how we build community. Because without communities, we're just a bunch of individuals who will likely not be able to accomplish very much. And I think being on the island is both an opportunity, but it's also a challenge.
David, I want to thank you. I'll present to you some gifts that are almost as valuable as potatoes. We're going to transition now to Rob Greenwood, who's going to, from the Harris Institute in St. John's, Newfoundland. So I'll invite him up to the podium to talk about the economics of climate.
I'm not going to go to the podium. Jim asked me to facilitate a discussion here, and delighted to do so. I'll stick with the mic, which is uncharacteristic for me. Some folks here know me way too well, like Lori and Harry and Godfrey.